Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this ongoing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you very, very much, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to today's edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a Wednesday. It is the 9th day of July. We are moving towards the middle of the month and the middle of the summer, as it were, and it is a pleasure to be with you, as it always is. I get so excited about some of the material that we've been dealing with. I continue to talk to people and share with people the absolute delight that I thought we all experienced last week with the call from Horst in Taiwan. I really enjoyed it. And again, every time I think of the magic of talking to somebody on the other side of the world in real time, it's just amazing. And it's kind of interesting because we're, as many of you know, we're here in southern West Virginia. And communications kind of leave a little bit to be desired here. My wife is in the business of searching for a plan for a cell phone. Her contract with her current carrier is up, and she really hasn't been happy with what they've given her over the 2 years at all. And so she's looking, and of course we're considering them, but because of the mountains and because we're in West Virginia, sometimes the signals aren't as good. You don't get as good a reception in some places as you do in others, or those kinds of questions. Last night we were watching the news, the national news, and of course the absolute chaos that seems to be underway in the Middle East. And again, the Middle East has been cooking and brewing for a long time, as we all know. But it looks like it's all breaking loose. And of course, instead of trying to find ways to resolve the problem, it seems like people are spending more time trying to figure out how they can politically benefit from the problem at the expense of others. I see the same thing underway in the situation on the border with immigrants, especially with these thousands of children that are flooding across our southern borders principally into Texas. And rather than sitting down and trying to solve the problem, it seems like people who really ought to know better are looking for ways to blame this on the administration, and are not looking for ways to solve the problem, but to pin the problem on the current administration. And it kind of renders the whole political process, to me, it seems to be stained and corrupt. I mean, I just can't help it, because these are real problems that demand real solution. These are real children. These are real human beings. And you listen to the different sides, and of course, one side says that we need to protect our borders and send them all back, and that's the position that the president seems to be taking. And the critics of that are saying, but these are children, these are human beings, and for every one that makes it across, 5 don't. This kind of thing, and you begin to wonder sometimes. So anyway, back to the issue of communications and cell phones and where we are. We're looking at the situation in the Middle East last night. Of course, the reality is that cell phones are driving protests and revolutions throughout the Middle East. And I was telling my wife, these different factions over there are conducting revolutions and government overthrows using cell phones. And here we are in West Virginia, and you can't get one to work. So what does that tell you about what we get and where we are on life's totem pole, so to speak? So anyway, these are the kinds of issues. But again, I not only share that, but I talk about the conversation we had with Horst and our communications revolution, being able to talk to somebody in real time on the other side of the world. And then I think about going back on the air and revisiting some of these absolutely delicious quotes from the 18th century, from Scottish philosophers, from Thomas Jefferson, from James Madison, from Adam Smith, and some of these other folks. And I just find them so rich and so meaningful and so thoughtful and so sensitive, so human. And I just, again, think to myself, why is it that we all can't sit down and get our arms around these things and try to understand them and learn from them and benefit from them, and then better understand where our founders were coming from, instead of trying to use the founders for a political agenda or an economic agenda, or, a little bit of both, more than likely. But it's just the idea that we seem to have become a society which continues to look for advantage. It's not an accident that more often than not the commercials that we see, especially on local television, at least here, and I presume it's true in other parts of the country as well, focus on law firms and these massive class action suits based on particular drugs and particular pharmaceuticals and mechanical hips that don't work and knees that don't work and all of this other stuff, and you may be eligible to receive money. All you have to do is call us and sign on. But this litigious society that we seem to have is so contrary. That's why I'm finding these quotations from Francis Hutcheson and Adam Smith and David Hume and Thomas Jefferson and the rest of them so absolutely delightful, because we're looking at an attitude towards human beings, toward mankind, that is so refreshing in today's world to just look at and think about and reflect upon. That's what we're doing here at the Virtual Center. I hope, I trust that you are getting even a little bit as much out of this as I am. And again, I talk about how honored I am to be here at the Virtual Center, and how honored I am that the folks at Head On Radio Network see enough value in a program like this that we can run it on a regular basis, as we've been doing now for better than 15 months. We began on the 11th of March in 2013, and it is now the 9th of July in 2014. That's pretty good. That's beyond 15 months. That's pretty darn good, I think. And I'm just so honored to be able to come and share with you some of these thoughts. And I don't mean to make this totally personal, and I'll get off this bandwagon I'm on in a second. But I want to, and I'm probably remiss in not doing this more often, but I really want to thank all of the Head On Radio Network and the people who listen, and Horst and Betsy in Texas and some of the other folks, Gene and the people who tune in regularly, Dr. John, and honor me, and I mean that, by giving me the opportunity to really dig into things that have meant so much to me my whole life. I mean, at this point in my professional life, which, I've retired within the past year, so I'm effectively retired, but I really don't want to retire. And this program, this opportunity for me, means that I don't have to retire, and I can use my time doing what I love. And the program kind of spurs me on and drives me on to do this, and to continue learning, and to continue thinking, and to continue to write. And as mentioned, that each day when the program is over, I try to sit down and do a synopsis and put it on this file or document that I'm developing, which are brief summations or synopses, if you will, of the programs that we do. And so every day I get the opportunity to write a couple of meaningful paragraphs on the programs that we've developed. And I'm so honored because I know so many people that don't have this opportunity, and I'm so grateful for it. And I want to thank all of you for it, and I mean that. I do invite you to share your thoughts with us, not just with me, obviously, but with our listeners, and invite you to use the phone number that we have reserved specifically for the opportunity to get you and your ideas on the air. The phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. If you'd like to communicate with me directly on these ideas and concepts, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, BRIEN 906@gmail.com. And again, one more time, the phone number 304-574-8178. In looking back over our last 5 or 6 programs, principally focusing on the Scottish Enlightenment approach to the founding, specifically to the Declaration of Independence, the reason that I have chosen to go into this kind of detail on this particular material is because so few do. And, as I mentioned in previous programs, the most visible, popularly read treatment of this subject is Garry Wills' book called Inventing America. It was his first book. It was written in 1978. And while it was very popular amongst the general population, it really didn't get much traction from the professional historical community. And as I mentioned at the beginning of yesterday's program, I'm more and more inclined to believe that the reason for that, at least in part, is because the orthodox interpretation of the Declaration of Independence has become so fixed and so basic to the particular political and economic agendas of some very, very influential people and interests in the society, that these alternatives, it seems to me, are being discouraged. That's the easiest, softest way to say it. They are being discouraged. And the criticisms of this approach are so strong that it makes you wonder, as I quoted the other day from Shakespeare, sometimes me think they protest too much. And, I can't get away from it. In my reading in preparation for today's program, in going back over reading some of these absolutely delicious quotes and going back, and I'm hoping that we can probably reach conclusion of Garry Wills' book, Inventing America, today, and then we can maybe wrap up the first program next week and try to pull it all together. But one of the things I've been able to lay my hands on is, I mentioned that there are a number of reviews on Garry Wills, and many of them by very prominent historians, and the one I have in mind is Marvin Myers. Marvin Myers is a very reputable historian and considered to be one of the nation's experts on the Jackson period in American history. Marvin Myers' critical review of Garry Wills' book, written at the time, at the time he published it, was extremely negative. It was caustic. And it's bothered me a little bit, and that's kind of what's gotten me thinking. But in the course of looking at these things, I came across a review of Garry Wills' book whose intent was really to summarize. Actually, the book, and it's a book that I have referred to here at the Virtual Center a number of times in the past. It's a book called Interpreting the Founding, Guide to the Enduring Debates over the Origins and Foundations of the American Republic. The author is Alan Gibson. And where I know Alan Gibson from is the James Madison Institute at Princeton University. And I mentioned that this is that this James Madison Institute at Princeton has kind of become a conservative, I guess I could say right-wing, but I don't know whether that's an accurate word for everybody there, especially for Alan Gibson, because it's not. Alan Gibson is a former James Madison Fellow in this institute. He received institute funding for doing his research and publishing this book, among others, The Interpretation of the Founding. It's a bibliographical treatment of the ways that professionals, not just historians, but political scientists and constitutional scholars and attorneys and all the rest of it, have looked at the founding over the years. It's a wonderful resource, a wonderful roadmap, as it were, to put together a bibliography to really get into, in some depth, some of these areas. I find it extremely, extremely valuable. Well, one of the chapters, his 5th chapter in his book on interpreting the founding, is on the Scottish Enlightenment school on the founding. And he calls it, his title for chapter 5 is called The Scottish Conversation. And in it he deals with the leading names, many of them we've touched upon in recent weeks. Francis Hutcheson, William Duncan, that's one name we haven't touched upon, Lord Keynes, Adam Ferguson, Thomas Reid, and most importantly, David Hume and Adam Smith. We've touched on all of these. And Alan Gibson does a good job of looking at the Scottish Enlightenment and the impact that it has had on scholarship surrounding the founding. And in addressing the work of Garry Wills, his book Inventing America, Alan Gibson does a pretty good job of summarizing the book. And of course this is really important, and the reason I think it has benefits here for us at the Virtual Center right now is because we've gone into so much depth on so many aspects of the link between the Scottish Enlightenment on the one hand and the origins of the Declaration of Independence, the founding, on the other, that maybe I thought it might be a good time here on this Wednesday program to kind of take a couple of steps back and try to embrace Garry Wills in totality, kind of look at the whole thing. And what that requires is kind of a summary of the book. And that's what Alan Gibson is doing here in his book entitled Interpreting the Founders. He's not selling one interpretation over another. He's trying to elaborate and to explain all of the major interpretations of the founding. So consequently, he's doing exactly what we need right now, I believe, which is a good summary. You know, a way to kind of pull all of this together. What I do want to get into today, more specifically in our program, is the whole issue of property and the whole question of unalienable rights, as Jefferson used the term in the Declaration of Independence. Endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We focused on the pursuit of happiness. We've touched a little bit on the issue of liberty. We haven't done a whole lot with the idea of life, but I think in the past we have, because we've looked at, and especially this is Locke's idea that life is something that we have inherited from the Creator. And consequently, life is not really our own, but we do have a certain responsibility to the Creator. And Locke uses this as his justification for his arguments in the second treatise against suicide. He's very adamant that we don't have the right to do this, that the only one that has the right to take our life is the source that granted it, which is the Almighty. And I think in our Christian society today, I really think that's an attitude or an approach that most people are pretty comfortable with. And so consequently, I haven't taken a lot of time with it. But I thought all of us might benefit from, just briefly, and it probably won't take but maybe, half of our first hour, but I thought that all of us might be able to benefit from Alan Gibson's summary of Garry Wills' book, Inventing America, because it kind of is a review of where we've been, and it's kind of an introduction for today's program, and where I think we'll go is into the whole issue of property, natural rights, and unalienable rights as they had meaning to Jefferson. And of course, what we're looking at is trying to get some idea as to the influences on Jefferson when he used these terms. And we'll get into those after this. But I thought that a summary of Garry Wills and what he has essentially set out to do would be a very valuable way to begin this third program in this week's edition of the Virtual Center. Alan Gibson points out that in Inventing America, Garry Wills presents 4 major or central revisions of the Lockean interpretation of the Declaration of Independence. In other words, in 4 major areas, Garry Wills takes on Carl Becker and takes on those who have, in effect, secured the Lockean view of the Declaration of Independence in concrete. The first revision of the Lockean interpretation of the Declaration, Wills argues that Jefferson's conception of self-evident truths, and we dealt quite a bit with this yesterday, Wills argues that Jefferson's conception of self-evident truths was fused from the common sense philosophy of Thomas Reid and the moral sense philosophy of Francis Hutcheson, with Hutcheson, quote, in charge, unquote. And this is pretty much a review of yesterday's program, because we spent quite a bit of time yesterday looking at some of the most relevant quotes, statements on self-evident truths from Thomas Reid, and then linking them to connections with Jefferson. And then we went towards the end of the program and looked at 3 specific areas from Francis Hutcheson which were extremely close to Jefferson's wording in the Declaration of Independence, specifically about the rights of revolution and the rights of the people to restore power, to abolish government, and to create a new government more consistent with the power that the people are willing to give it. This is one area, then, that Wills takes on John Locke directly. To continue with Alan Gibson's treatment of this first area of revision. Reid, not Locke, Wills maintains, was the author of the most important and widespread conception of self-evident truths in the 18th century. Reid's common sense philosophy for self-evident truths was both egalitarian and communitarian, and we talked about that yesterday. That when Reid talked about common sense, he meant community sense. And so to Reid, self-evident truths were community's truths, the things that the community at large took as givens, as unquestioned fact. And as Alan Gibson points out, this common sense philosophy of self-evident truths was both egalitarian, in other words, it emphasized equality, and communitarian as well. It emphasized not so much the individual as the community in which the individual functions. Wills stressed that in matters of perception, everyone was equally qualified. So, and again, this is Thomas Reid, that in perception, which is Reid's first stage of knowledge, everyone was equally qualified. Reid also stressed that common sense, self-evident truth, reflected shared wisdom of the community. In other words, it was community sense. Common sense was community sense. Meanwhile, as previously mentioned, Gibson says, Hutcheson developed the concept of a moral sense in reaction to the system of philosophical egotism of Thomas Hobbes and Bernard Mandeville, and made it the basis of his contention that benevolence, not self-interest, was the principal spring of human actions and the proper foundation of moral philosophy. So, in a sense, in this first major revision of the Lockean approach to the Declaration of Independence, Wills is arguing that the influence of Reid and Hutcheson on Jefferson's idea of self-evident truths and the application of common sense is much closer to the mark than the traditional argument, orthodox argument, that Jefferson's approach is 100% from John Locke. And let me share the last paragraph of Gibson's analysis on this first major revision with you. Jefferson, Wills argues, accepted Reid's understanding of the nature of perception and borrowed his phrase, self-evident truths, but then combined these with Hutcheson's understanding of the importance of the moral sense in detecting moral principles. So Wills argues that Jefferson even used Reid's phrase, self-evident truths, and combined them with Hutcheson's understanding of the importance of the moral sense in detecting moral principles. Although the moral sense played the central role of grasping moral principles, common sense perceptions played a background role in deciding the proper means to secure these principles. In this way, Garry Wills argues, Jefferson combined an equalitarian epistemology with a communitarian morality. Most important, this reading takes Jefferson out of the tradition of Lockean rationalism and establishes him as a moral sense philosopher who believed that moral principles were detected or felt, not grasped with reason. And we talked about that yesterday. That this initial stage of learning, of knowledge, which is based on perception, is the basis of equality. Because Jefferson argues, and we'll see that today, in the way Jefferson talked about blacks. Jefferson believed, and this gets us into the whole issue of the debate over Jefferson and his position on slavery. Jefferson believed that blacks as human beings were equal to whites in the idea of perception. All man learned equally. All man perceived equally. As we'll see in a quote from Jefferson, Jefferson was leaning toward the idea that the differences between blacks and whites that many people saw in society were differences of intellect and education and reasoning, not differences in basic equality. I think this is incredibly important. So that's Alan Gibson's treatment of the first major revision that Garry Wills brings to the orthodox interpretation of the Declaration. The second area of revision for Alan Gibson, Wills argued that Jefferson's concept of equality was also based on the moral sense, and we just kind of made reference to this. Specifically, rather than proposing a state of natural equality, Jefferson had meant that all individuals were equally possessed of the moral sense. And this belief, Wills asserts, was no light concession, but meant that men were essentially equal. For the moral sense is what makes man accountable to himself and to others, self-governing and consenting to social obligation. To Jefferson, Wills adds, the moral sense was man's highest faculty, because it is the faculty that gives man his unique dignity, that grounds his rights, that makes him self-governing, and that serves as the foundation of his sociability. So there's absolutely no question that what Garry Wills brings to the table here is that to Jefferson, equality was based on the moral sense, which was addressed principally by Francis Hutcheson. And it's the moral sense that is the basis for Jefferson saying that all men are created equal. Wow. I don't know if this is true or not in our quest of, for unquestioned truth, but it surely belongs on the table as a consideration. It's surely something that all of our young people, if they are to be responsible citizens in a republic, and to fulfill Jefferson's idea of the importance of an educated citizenry, not only Jefferson's idea, but Madison's idea as well, then there's no question that what Jefferson meant by equality belongs on the table. It comes first in the Declaration of Independence, before he gets into the question of inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He talks about all men being created equal. This, to Jefferson, is a priority. It's a priority in his declaration. And he puts it within the context of a self-evident truth. What makes it self-evident truth is, according to this scheme of the way of looking at it, that the vast majority of thinking people recognize that this is true, that human beings learned through perception. John Locke himself argued that in his essay on human understanding, that man came into the world as a blank slate, a tabula rasa, and that where man's knowledge came from was perception, experience, the environment in which he lives and grows up. These are the things that constitute man's education. This is Locke. So there's no real difference here between Locke and the Scottish philosophers on the issue of equality. So when John Locke talks about equality, this is what he's talking about. I think our students, our young people, need to know this stuff. They need to know that our founders believed that all men really are equal. We're created equal. That's why they said it. And again, what bothers me, and I'm off the mark here a little bit, but what I think we have to keep in mind is that there are certain people, in order to justify a particular agenda or a particular economic system, a particular way of organizing society, organizing government and organizing power, have chosen a particular way to interpret this in order to support the contemporary view of society that they want to achieve. We can't let them get away with this any longer. We have got to basically put the founders back on the table and let them speak for themselves. I'm in discussions, as I've mentioned before, about a domain name as we begin to develop a website that will be available here at the virtual center. And of course, looking for domain names, there's so many of them that are taken. And one that I threw into the pot today for consideration, and I've received both positive and negatives on this, because in selecting a domain name, what you're really looking for is something that people are more liable to click onto in a search, in an internet search, if they're looking for information on the founding or information on the Constitution or on the founders, the framers of the Constitution, whatever the issue that they're after is. You want, obviously, to come up with a domain name that is going to garner the most attention as people look for information on the World Wide Web. And so the debate, of course, is whether this is a little bit too catchy or whether, in fact, but I thought that it was a really good domain name, and what it is so saith the founders. So saith the founders. If you think about that, it's exactly what we were about here at the Virtual Center. We're focusing on the actual ideas and thinking and writing and speaking of the founders. We are going back to the beginning, to the origins themselves. So there's no question, it's an accurate interpretation, an accurate statement about what the Virtual Center is all about. The question is it marketable? In other words, is so saith, marketable enough to be a valuable domain name, or is it going to be buried on the, when you're searching for information, it'll be on the 18th page of potential links. And of course, what you want is to come up with something that people will go to almost immediately. And so the question is so saith the founders that kind of a site name. Anyway, so that's the second area of revision that Garry Wills addresses in his book, this concept of equality. Third, says Alan Gibson, Garry Wills argues that when Jefferson made the pursuit of happiness an inalienable right, he did not have in mind the protection of property or the satisfaction of the individual. Instead, Wills argues, Jefferson had deliberately not included property as an inalienable right because, following Hutcheson, he had considered it an adventitious right that came after the formation of society and was based on social conventions, not an inalienable right that preceded the formation of society. This is where I plan to go in our second hour today, is into this whole question of inalienable rights. So we'll look at this in a little bit more detail later. But the fact that Jefferson did not include property in the Declaration, and I think this is a question, Wills raises this question, Garry Wills does, and I raise it as well. If the Declaration of Independence was exclusively Lockean, if Jefferson's meaning and language came from Locke, rather from any of these other sources, then why didn't Jefferson adopt Locke's generally accepted, widely understood statement of natural rights to life, liberty, and property? If Jefferson was setting out to write a declaration based on John Locke, why did he not put property into the document as one of the inalienable rights? That's an important question. Garry Wills raises that question. He's right to. Something else. We've talked here in the last several programs about the idea of personal happiness, pursuit of happiness, and the extent to which some people are determined to assert that by pursuit of happiness, Jefferson meant property, even though he didn't say it. The contradiction here, of course, is that the very people who are saying this are the people who buy most directly into Antonin Scalia's originalism idea, that the only way to really understand constitutionalism is to go back to the original intent of the framers. The very people who argue this the loudest, the very people most inclined to support Antonin Scalia and Robert Bork and that whole position of original intent, are the same people that come around and say, well, Jefferson meant property, even though he didn't say it. That's what he meant. Come on. Can you really have it both ways? I don't think so. I think Garry Wills is right. I think the fact that Jefferson did not include property, the word property, in the Declaration of Independence is very significant. Let me even strengthen that statement a little bit further. We have mentioned in previous programs that Jefferson was involved in the drafting of the French Declaration of Rights in 1789 in France, that he partnered with Lafayette in drafting the French Declaration of Rights. And one of the points that we have made is that in the French Declaration of Rights, property and pursuit of happiness are used as two separate things. The way that Jefferson's statement in the French Declaration of Rights, Human Rights, which is drafted principally by Lafayette, separates property from happiness, suggests that when they use the word happiness, they don't mean property. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to say property. It is very significant that Jefferson himself advised Lafayette to take the word property out of the French Declaration of Human Rights. He was able to persuade Lafayette to take property, the word property, not include it in the French Declaration. What does this tell us? What it tells us is that these people who say, well, he said happiness, but he really meant property, are full of baloney. Because there's too much evidence to suggest that Jefferson's exclusion of the word property was by intention, by design. He wanted to make sure that property was not considered one of the so-called inalienable rights in the Declaration of Independence. In essence, Garry Wills, I think, is responsible for making a good case that the conservative argument today that Jefferson meant property when he said pursuit of happiness is not true.
Dr. Bill, may I ask a question, please?
Yes, Bob.
What is the difference, going back to what we were talking about, how Lincoln sort of revived the Declaration of Independence?
Uh-huh.
What's the difference between a Lincoln dealing with a declaration that says life, liberty, and property versus the Declaration as it was written?
I'm thinking one thing, but I'm not sure I'm on the right track. So tell me if I'm not. It seems to me Lincoln's principal goal in the 1860s, of course, is to deny the Southern argument that slaves are property.
Exactly where I was going.
Okay. And so, consequently, there's no way in the world that Jefferson could make the case in support of his, that Lincoln could make the case in support of his argument against slavery and at the same time include property in the Declaration of Independence. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does, and it leads to my second question.
Okay.
Does that not then bolster the argument that property was deliberately left out by Jefferson?
Yes.
As a sort of, because, we all understand that he wanted to address the issue of slavery.
Right.
And that it was taken out by committee because the Southern colonies would not come along.
Would not come along, exactly. And so the passage that Jefferson had included in the original draft of the Declaration on slavery was would have been a substantial portion of the whole Declaration. It was the longest section in the document, and it was totally stricken. And obviously, Jefferson, I believe, I firmly believe this. I believe that Jefferson indeed did believe that slaves, that blacks, were equal, that all human beings were indeed created equal in that they learned by perception. The first stage of knowledge, all human beings were equal. And if you've kind of prompted me, but let me see if I can find the quote, the Jefferson quote. It'll take me a moment. I was going to share this later, but here it is. This is Jefferson from his notes on the state of Virginia on blacks. Whether further observation will or will not verify the conjecture that nature has been less bountiful to them in the endowments of the head, I believe that in those of the heart she will be found to have done them justice. God, what a statement. That disposition to theft with which they have been branded must be ascribed to their situation and not to any depravity of the moral sense. We find among them numerous instances of the most rigid integrity, and as many as among their better instructed masters of benevolence, gratitude, and unshaken fidelity. That's from Jefferson's notes from the state of Virginia.
And that is, for its time, it's not a liberal statement, Dr. Bill. It's a radical statement.
It's a radical statement. And it basically raises serious questions about all of those who question Jefferson's morality and inconsistency on the Declaration. I believe that he said that he believed that on a basic level all human beings are equal. He said that in the Declaration. I think we have to believe him. I think we'd be crazy not to.
Can I put a stick in the spokes, Dr. Bill?
Go right ahead.
That is a radical statement. And we see what his conduct was and his instructions to Lewis and Clark during his presidency on their expedition. Where then do we put the really nasty statements in the Declaration of Independence about indigenous peoples? How do we square that?
Those would be the Native Americans.
Yes. Because
Jefferson,
there's that accusation that the king has caused, what is it, the heathen savage or savages,
yeah, right,
some sort of awful language, and that has always struck me as being wholly at odds with the equality doctrine that is put forward early on.
Right, and I think Jefferson believed in the idea of the noble savage. And I think he believed that, I mean, this is my sense, and I know Gordon Wood buys into this as well, because Gordon Wood talks about this as well, that Jefferson had a different view of Native Americans than he did of blacks. He believed that on a basic level, blacks were equal to everybody else. But as he says, once you get beyond that and the impact of education and situations and those kinds of things, then the development of blacks seems not to be as fruitful and as progressive as it is with other races. And when he looks at Native Americans, he sees them as kind of the noble savage idea that what we are finding in Native Americans is the evolution of mankind at its earliest stages. In other words, we're not looking, when we look at blacks, we're looking at the finished product. When we look at Native Americans, we're looking at an evolving product.
And yet it's been said that Jefferson, or at least, I don't know, maybe Adams and Franklin, because they were on the drafting committee, right? It's been said that at some point in time, someone consulted the Haudenosaunee, otherwise known as the Iroquois Nation, Constitution, as a means of understanding where we wanted our own new government to go by the time 1787 rolls around.
Right, and that's a program that I see in our future here at the center, is to look at the Iroquois Constitution.
And by extension, I guess I would ask, does this not show the perniciousness of the noble savage notion?
Well, elaborate on that more.
What I mean is that benevolent racism is as toxic as hateful racism.
Yes, yes.
Because there were cultures that had been driven out of their own lands. Well, just one comes to mind. Everybody in West Virginia knows the story of Laura Ingalls.
Yes.
And Follow the River, and how she was captured by native peoples during the frontier period, and eventually she escaped back to white culture by running away and following the New River until it led her back to her home place in Virginia.
Yes.
What doesn't get told in that story is that there were a lot of slaves and indentured whites and white folks generally who, coming into contact with the native peoples, went native.
Went native.
Because, I mean, for instance, when she was captured, Laura Ingalls' last bath had probably been sometime in the last 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
She was captured by a people who were meticulously clean and made a point of bathing every day.
Mm-hmm.
She was part of a culture that was decidedly misogynistic and male-dominated, and was taken into a culture in which decisions were made non-sexistly. That the Shawnee people had a peace chief and a war chief, and the peace chief and the peace council was run by women.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so it's hard to square some of this stuff up. I mean,
right. It sure is.
That Jefferson, because I think there's something that's lurking here, and that is that Jefferson's impressions of people well, African slaves and people who had been stolen from Africa, I think his impression of them is colored, which is probably not the right word,
right,
by the fact that by 1776, people of color and white folks had been interacting culturally for 176 years or more.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have begun to take on, they have each begun to take on characteristics of the other.
Yes.
There's a famous linguist, for instance, who, and I can't recall the name, who says pretty dispositively that the, pardon the phone,
that's
says pretty dispositively that the southern accent that we recognize,
right,
the gooey Scarlet O'Hara,
yeah.
that's not some sort of an evolution of the Scots-Irish English or even the English spoken by the people who first colonized, but rather that accent is a typical evolutionary amalgam that comes from the Africanization of English as spoken.
That's right.
By the people who were brought over here.
That's right.
And it's always fun to imagine, for instance, telling some Klansman that his proud Southern accent is actually an African accent.
Yeah, but exactly. Yeah.
But it can be found. It can be discerned.
Yeah. Another part of connection to this, Bob, is the extent to which black culture continues to be female dominated rather than male dominated in family structure, and how I can remember Daniel Patrick Moynihan's stuff in the 1960s, where this was a major problem for a lot of people, a lot of psychologists and stuff, that black culture seemed to insist that the female should be dominant rather than the male, and this was one facet of amalgamation that didn't take. Well,
is that a carry? Just as we were talking about the Native American social structures that were much less sexist, is that a carryover from a more egalitarian African society?
It darn well could be. Yes. Boy, you raised some beautiful questions here, Bob. I mean, well,
this is I don't speak only for myself. This is what happens, Dr. Bill.
Yeah, I know.
Every time I sit here quietly producing the program,
yeah,
there are little brain bombs that go off.
Well, that's what this whole effort is about, is to basically launch brain bombs. I mean, that's what I'm about.
You've got a listener out in California by the name of Richard, who has been a dear friend of the program for a very long time.
Uh-huh.
And he pops into the chat room during my program every now and then, and he said on the air, talking to me as well, he has said, Dr. Bill makes me feel like I'm high. And on another occasion he said, Dr. Bill is intellectual acid. As in,
yeah,
take a trip. And he's not saying that negatively. He is saying that extremely positively, because it is mind expanding. And then I'm just going to share one more thing. I got a note from our good friend Dr. John yesterday.
Uh-huh.
And he said only this. He said, Bob, I'm listening to Dr. Bill's podcast from yesterday. He has been on fire the past 2 weeks. I just heard him say, and he quotes you, If you just joined us, we were setting the scientific background for the worldview of the 18th century. And Dr. John follows that quote, and I laughed when I first saw it, and I laugh now. He says, "Where else? What other network will you get that?" And if anyone hasn't heard him before, don't get scared off by that line. What he's been talking about is fascinating and deeply relevant to today, and you can jump in any time.
Oh, wow. That's great. Thank you, Bob.
And I remember,
thank you for sharing that with me.
We've got another friend, Ron in Raleigh, who has said from time to time, talking about the horn, when we will go off down a path like setting the scientific background for the worldview of the 18th century. Ron in Raleigh will write and say, and he's got his tongue lodged, way over in his cheek, imitating Rush Limbaugh. Today on the Excellence in Broadcasting Network, we will examine the scientific background for the worldview of the 18th century, and then underneath it he'll say, "Yet another thing you will never hear on right-wing radio."
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing this with me because, it really is important, because that's really what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to promote a particular interpretation over another. I'm trying to basically stir the pot and give people an opportunity to reflect upon and think about things that they haven't thought about before. I really believe that's what's missing in education.
And promote the simple, seemingly, idea of critical thinking.
Yes.
I have never heard you say, and I don't think I've ever said it either, "Here is how it is. No. This is the received wisdom. This is beyond question." Neither of us have ever done that.
No.
And we're not going to.
We're not going to.
Because there is enough of that going on already.
I was going to say that's what we're dealing with all the time. And it's frightening because alternatives, when alternatives are introduced or brought to the table, they become alternative ways of defining truth. In other words, truth is not that, truth is this. The fact of the matter is, what you're not doing is giving people the opportunity to discover truth for themselves.
But isn't truth itself a bit of an intellectual grenade, Dr. Bill?
Yeah. I think I know what you mean. Yeah.
Because if everybody can have his own truth, then nothing is truth.
Then there's no truth. Exactly.
Every true believer in a faith system is an atheist to all other faiths, and thus everybody becomes a heretic or an infidel. Right. And so, what I get out of what you're doing here is you're trying to find the facts that are discernible and to create and to make critically reasoned arguments from them.
Right, and that's what. But Bob, that's what these people, some of these quotes that we're reading, that's what these people are saying. We just haven't listened to them. I mean, these people were saying this in the 17th and 18th century. They were telling us how to educate people. They were telling us how knowledge is built and how man learns. And I mean, God, all we've got to do is listen. But we have all of these people with all of these different agendas that have something to gain by asserting or imposing a particular way of teaching and learning and organizing society and governing society and organizing the economy and everything else. Look what they've done to Adam Smith. I mean, my God. The Adam Smith of his book on moral sentiments is so different than the Adam Smith we hear about, from the right, basically today, because they're the ones that are still preaching the ideas of Adam Smith, and they're the ones that are out to own the founders. I mean, it's just amazing.
I may get some pushback on this question, but maybe you can answer it. Why did the left abandon Adam Smith? And of course, I'm no spokesman for the left, but
I don't know, and I'll be honest with you, I don't know. Why did...
Because you can read Adam Smith and Thomas Paine side by side.
Yes, you can. I'm not too sure. I think that the answer to that question may be, and this is just a guess because I don't know, I think we're witnessing one of those circumstances which are all too frequent, where we are allowing people with an agenda to define truth for us. We're allowing people who have an agenda to tell us what Adam Smith is saying.
Bingo.
And accepting that rather than reading Adam Smith for ourselves.
And the first thing that comes, do you mind me hijacking a few minutes like this?
Oh, go right ahead. Go.
The first thing that comes to mind is the difference between Western and Eastern approaches to knowledge. Think, for instance, about Sun Tzu's The Art of War. Now, a few years ago, it was very fashionable for your Wall Street hedge fund, predatory trader types to read The Art of War, because it had been told us that Japanese executives read it, and that's why they're whipping our butts.
Yes.
So I was exposed to The Art of War in college, and it's set up in a way where you have a statement from Sun Tzu,
mm-hmm.
and then you have 7 statements from 7 different sages on what Sun Tzu meant.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, we don't, and they're all included because they all have some relevance.
Right. They all are worth thinking about or knowing.
Right, but there's no star beside one particular statement saying, and this is the received wisdom.
Right. And our whole education system is based on the fact that there are stars behind every piece of information that's included in curriculum.
Exactly.
There's nothing
left. So in answer to the question of, why did the left abandon Smith, maybe it's because there was no left to abandon him. But secondly, the progressive ideas that he enunciates, not just in The Wealth of Nations, but far more so in Moral Sentiments.
Right.
The ideas that he puts forward were made odious by the people who used him as their sounding board, or not their sounding board, but, remember when George W. Bush said, we're going to catapult the propaganda?
Right.
That.
Right. Yeah.
And to a certain extent, I think that's what happened. People using Adam Smith as the bloody shirt that they waved atop the hill made Adam Smith odious to people who wanted to talk about a just society, a moral society, a righteous society. And just to go back to that thing that I raised last week, it's this, and I think it comes out of the same kind of transmission of teaching notion that we compared the way fundamentalists treat Paul versus Jesus with the way they treat Abraham Lincoln versus Thomas Jefferson.
Right, and that's what I was going to just go back to again, is Lincoln. I mean, look what these same folks have done to Lincoln, because they've taken Lincoln out of context, and they want to impose Lincoln on Jefferson, because they like what Lincoln said without considering the context within which Lincoln was operating. What Lincoln was trying to do was use the principles of the Declaration of Independence to make the case for equality in society with the abolition of slavery. Instead of that, what they do is they take what Lincoln is trying to do and they want to impose it on the past, on Jefferson, and have Jefferson saying something that never even occurred to him.
Which is exactly how they treat the Bible.
Yes, it is, Bob.
For instance, in the current, and it's not so much of a debate as it used to be, mercifully, but in the current national discussion over LGBT rights, the right wing continues to quote Leviticus and St. Paul and try to make them be the words of Jesus.
Yes.
When Jesus was, in fact, absolutely silent on the topic.
That's exactly right.
And one of those little thought grenades that you set off in my brain a little bit ago was this: the right, by way of trying to come up with truth instead of factual analysis arrived at by critical thinking, the right tries to impose dogmatic answers upon the founders and framers that aren't there, and they're trying to fill in the gaps in their silence. And of course, there's no greater perpetrator of this than, for instance, Antonin Scalia.
Yes.
Who likes to, any first-year law student understands you can't prove a negative, all right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But the whole of Antonin Scalia's career is predicated on the assertion that if the framers of the Constitution were silent, they therefore disapproved of whatever Antonin Scalia doesn't like.
That's right. That's right.
So most recently he said there is no guarantee against discrimination against women in the Constitution.
Uh-huh.
You were talking at the beginning of the program. I was actually going to make mention of something to you later. I just read an article less than an hour ago about the fact that Clarence Thomas is now making the argument that there is absolutely nothing in the Constitution that prevents an individual state, Alabama, West Virginia, New York, Massachusetts, from establishing a state religion.
I've heard that before, Bob. Yeah.
And that's crazy.
Right.
I mean, it's not an alternative interpretation. No. It is just chase him with a butterfly net. Crazy.
Right. It's because what they're basically saying is if the Constitution doesn't say you can't do it, then you can. God,
and that is not what the Constitution was ever meant to be.
No, that's not it at all. And what they're doing is assuming that the Constitution is the Bible, that all truth is in there, and if it's not there, it's not truth. And I mean that's really you're right. That's exactly where a lot of the stuff goes. And I think that the only way to begin to get a handle on some of this stuff is to go back to the people that are actually being used and misinterpreted and manipulated, and go back and say, I mean, this is what Jefferson said about blacks. When it came to learning from the heart, nature treated them with the same justice that he treated everybody else. We are indeed all created equal.
And so what he says about the head is not, he's not saying that I want to be clear about this.
Yeah.
Because you can take this quote several ways.
Oh, you sure can.
What he's saying about the head, and do you have the quote handy?
Yes, wait a minute. I've got it right here. Yes.
Okay, the front end of it is where he talks about the head. Could we get that again?
Okay, yeah. Whether further observation will or will not verify the conjecture that nature has been less bountiful to them in the endowment of the head.
Okay, right there.
I believe those in the heart will be found to have done them justice.
So the second portion is him asserting making a factual statement or an argument statement.
Right.
The first part is speculative. The whether or not statement.
Yes.
And so he is reflecting upon the fact that other people are out there saying, well, they just ain't as smart as us.
They just ain't as smart as we are. Exactly.
And he's not conceding that ground.
No, he is saying it may or may not be true. We don't know that. Further observation will deal with that. He said whether further observation will determine that or not, we don't know.
And further observation,
we do know.
And further observation means something too, Dr. Bill. Further observation is a reflection of Jefferson's status for his time and place as a scientist. He's not willing to go back to Genesis and say, well, the curse of Ham has been laid upon them.
No, he's basically saying you've got to go and find the evidence. You've got to base your conclusions on evidence.
And the way we reach those conclusions is by scientific observation, of which he was a practitioner. If you give equal educational opportunity to black and white alike, there's your answer. Mm-hmm. And it took us a couple of 100 years, but hell, by the time Frederick Douglass comes along and people before him, we're finding out the answer to Jefferson's question, and that is Yeah, equal.
Yeah.
And I think, because it's real easy to just blow past that speculative clause there and say, wow, look at Jefferson. But it's not. The man, there was a book written about him several years ago called American Sphinx. Because he seems he's like, it's like trying to juggle a goldfish. You think you've got a handle on him, and then he slips away.
That's right. He's a thinking, learning human being that I think is I find it extremely respectable.
Absolutely.
When he contradicts himself, it's because he's learning. He's continuing to think.
And that's not to say he is without flaws.
No.
His behavior relative to Aaron Burr was reprehensible.
Mm-hmm.
His attitude and his attitude toward his cousin John Marshall, he was terribly jealous. We do know that he had this high, squeaky speaking voice, and we know that he probably had what we would refer to in our age as a shyness disorder.
Mm-hmm. He did.
And there's his cousin John Marshall that was a smart family.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, lots of privilege, lots of education, lots of smart people. And so there's the sparkling, shining, erudite John Marshall swanning around what passed for polite society in Washington, D.C., and Jefferson sitting there in the White House terrified.
Yeah.
I mean, you might even argue that he was a tiny bit agoraphobic.
Yeah.
And so don't think for a minute that by the time Adams becomes president, and Jefferson's and Adams' differences have become pretty much out in the open, don't think for a minute that John Adams didn't know what he was doing.
Yeah.
Was it Adams who appointed Marshall?
Yeah, it was. I was just thinking the other night, over the weekend, the holiday weekend, we watched the PBS series on John Adams. We watched a couple of episodes, and the treatment of Jefferson in that when they're drafting the Declaration of Independence is so accurate. Where, Adams makes the point to him, we've been here all of this time, and you haven't said 2 words on the floor of this Congress. And, of course, Adams's point is that's why you need to write the Declaration, because they don't hate you, they hate me. That's what he says. He's exactly right.
And that's a matter of practical realism, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, it's great. I mean, it's just one. But they've captured that in the program. It's very, very good. But
I apologize for the hijacking, but
this is wonderful. Can we take about a 3-minute break?
We absolutely can.
It's 18 minutes after the hour. I'll be back in 2 minutes. Thank you, Bob. We're at 20 minutes after the hour. We've got about 40 minutes to go in today's program. I want to thank you all very, very much. Bob, I want to thank you for joining in. What a wonderful conversation. I mean, we took it in so many different directions. But that quote from Jefferson on the way he looked at blacks is so important because it runs so counter to what people try to say, the negatives, the negative folks about Jefferson and the hypocrisy of the Declaration and all of that. When in fact, when you study this man, what you begin to see is he spent many of his waking hours trying desperately to understand, to know. And the fact of the matter is many of the people who are most critical of him are people that are too intellectually lazy to want to know. They find something that they're very comfortable with that somebody else said, and they adopt it as their own. And then they try to basically reinterpret other people in order to make sure that they are saying the same things that people want them to say. When Bob was making reference to Anton Scalia, and I'm struck by the statement we looked at in the first hour today, that Jefferson consciously did not include property in the Declaration of Independence, yet those who want him to mean property in the pursuit of happiness are more than comfortable saying, well, he didn't say property, but that's what he meant. I mean, talk about playing fast and loose with the past. Absolutely incredible. Would love to hear from any of you out there. That we have a half an hour left. Then we'll be 3 or 4 days before we get back together again, and we'll revisit some of this stuff then. But our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. My email address again, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. And if I can take a moment before getting back into the 18th century, during the brief break we just took, it was just occurring to me that I was thinking back after our conversation, Bob's conversation here on the air in the last 15, 20 minutes or so, and thinking back to Horst's call from Taiwan last week, which was better than a half an hour long. That really what we're talking about here is the need to encourage people to spend time thinking and talking and sharing and competing with ideas. Jefferson himself believed and says the importance of, he doesn't use the term the marketplace of ideas, but that's what he's talking about. The basis of a community is the exchange of ideas. When ideas start moving around, societies start moving forward. And it seems to me, and I'm not claiming anything exclusive here on the part of the virtual center at all. What I'm talking about here is the Head On Radio Network. And the people who regularly listen to it, you, the people out there in the audience. We've got to do a better job, all of us, in making this voice heard, in keeping this kind of intellectualism and intellectual exchange out there. Because what's becoming clear is that when you look at some of the statements of these people, some of these quotations, and then you listen to what you can do with these, what you can make of them, what you can learn from them, what I begin to realize, and what I know you begin to realize as well, is that all of us are, to use the technical term, educable. People can learn. People can think. People can understand. People can process and reason. To claim that we have an education system that doesn't even engage in these kinds of activities is disgraceful. One of the things that occurred to me in just over the few moments that we were off the air is that there's more education going on the Head On Radio Network than there is in every school system in the United States. And it deserves support. It deserves support, and it is getting support from the people who respect it and value it and indeed come forward and support it. What we need to do is find ways to expand that audience, that support system out there, because it's very important that this stay on, because it doesn't happen in other places. It really does not. We are at 27 minutes after the hour, so I'd like to go back and finish up a little bit on Alan Gibson's summation, if you will, of Garry Wills' book, Inventing America. And again, he talked about the fact that there were 4 central revisions in our views toward the Declaration of Independence that Wills addresses, and we've looked at 3 of them already. The first one was the idea of self-evident truths as reflected in the writings and philosophy of Thomas Reid, and the extent to which Jefferson seems to adopt that. And Jefferson's idea, along with Reid, of the use of the term self-evident truths is common, and also Reid's idea of common sense is really community sense. And there's no question that Jefferson reflects an awful lot of this. The second major revision area that we touched upon here is Jefferson's concept of liberty, the idea that all men are created equal, and the extent to which it is based directly on the idea of the moral sense as explained and defined by Francis Hutcheson. And then the third area, and this was basically what we were looking at toward the end of our first hour, is Jefferson's idea of the pursuit of happiness and the idea of happiness being an unalienable right. And there are 2 ways to go with this here. And one of them we've already done, which is what do they mean by happiness? And I would suggest to you that once you get into what Jefferson meant by happiness, then you have to deal with his inclusion of it as one of the inalienable rights. Because I would suggest to you that Jefferson's conscious exclusion of property suggests that property to him is not an inalienable right. It is an alienable right. It is a right that can be transferred, like alienable property. Think, for example, of Jefferson's behavior, Jefferson's work in fighting the laws of entail and primogeniture in Virginia prior to the American Revolution. Without going into too much depth here, the laws of entail and primogeniture were laws that were part of the traditions of the medieval period, of medieval Europe. The idea of primogeniture was the idea that property passed on to the eldest son. And the purposes of this was to maintain the power and position of the aristocracy. And since so much of that influence was based on property, on the estate, on the family holdings, that the only way to preserve the power and the influence of family from generation to generation was to maintain the property intact. And the way societies did that is to enact laws which required the passing on of the entire estate to the eldest son. The implication is that property was alienable. It was an entity that could be passed on, could be transferred, readily transferred. It was amenable to transfer. It was alienable. When Jefferson's talking about inalienable rights, he's talking about rights that can't be transferred. And he consciously takes property out of that equation. Because property is not, to Jefferson, an inalienable right, it is an alienable right. And what that means is that if property is not an inalienable right, then it is inaccurate, it is wrong, it is unethical for people to define the role of government as protecting people's inalienable rights and including property as one of those rights, and implying that the purpose of government is to protect private property and people's freedom to acquire that property, which is the basis of the rights argument for free enterprise and the whole idea of the natural rights philosophy, the whole idea of the neoconservatives and their effort to promote the idea of natural rights philosophy, that the purpose of government was to protect people's natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and to basically use Jefferson's Declaration as the basis for that, which in effect to them becomes using the Declaration as the basic statement of principle for the nation. That what America is about is the freedom to own and pursue property and have it protected, the value of wealth, the power and influence associated with wealth and success, who matters and who doesn't in society as being justified by this, when in fact this is exactly the opposite of what Thomas Jefferson meant when he was talking about all men being created equal and all men having the ability to learn. The gift of perception and the ability to learn by what they perceive. And the fact that all people, rich, poor, black, white, learn the same way. In that sense, they were endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. All men were created equal, and they were endowed with inalienable rights, and property was not one of them. And I think we have to basically take that to the bank. The last revisionary point that Garry Wills' book addresses is the idea that the pursuit of happiness is not only not Lockean, it's anti-Lockean. The pursuit of happiness is not private or vague. According to Garry Wills' approach, when Jefferson spoke of pursuing happiness, he was talking here about public happiness, and believed that public happiness was, quote, susceptible of numbered measurement and distribution and the test and justification of any government. And I'm quoting here from Alan Gibson's review, summation of Wills's book. Together, these novel readings presented a Jefferson who was a radical equalitarian, a communitarian, a sentimentalist, not a Lockean individualist. The Lockean Jefferson began with the assumption that men are autonomous and self-interested, conceived of rights as spheres around individuals in which the government was not allowed to exercise power, and believed that governments were instituted to secure the safety, freedom, and property of their citizens, not to positively promote any particular conception of human happiness. Garry Wills' Hutchesonian Jefferson, however, began with the assumption that individuals are naturally benevolent, sociable, interdependent, and that life in society is the natural state of mankind. Wills' Jefferson also conceived of rights as arising in society and as means of promoting the public good, and believed that the very legitimacy of government was ensured only by government's ability to promote a scientifically measurable conception of public happiness. Merrill Peterson And his consideration of Garry Wills's book makes the following statement about Garry Wills's book, Inventing America. Wills's reading of the Declaration of Independence is in terms of Hutcheson rather than Locke. And according to Merrill Peterson, it amounts to the substitution of duties for rights, community for individualism, consensus for contract, affections for reason. Think about those four characteristics. And if you do, and you link those in your mind with Garry Wills, you'll read his books. Jefferson's Declaration of Independence is more Francis Hutcheson than it is John Locke, and that it amounts to the substitution of duties for rights. We have labeled this program the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility, not civic rights, civic responsibilities. Substitutes duties for rights, community for individualism, consensus for contract, affections for reason. To my mind, there is absolutely no question that competent scholarly treatment of the Declaration of Independence with those kinds of emphases belongs on the table when people study the early history of their nation. To take this entirely off the table and to dismiss it, worse than dismiss, to ignore it, to pretend that it's not even there, is the epitome, I would suggest, of anti-intellectualism. It is not scholarship. It is the exact opposite of scholarship. It is anti-intellectualism. It is a statement of society's purpose not to educate its citizens, but to brainwash them. Not to equip citizens in this republic with the skills to pursue truth, but to assert for these people, for citizens, the idea that truth has already been successfully defined and needs only to be transmitted, which in effect is to reduce the ability of individual citizens to think to a non-consideration, a non-entity. Consider an education system whose ultimate goal is not to encourage thinking, but to discourage it. Not to teach people how to learn, but rather to tell them what to learn. I find this very, very disturbing. And I think that our time spent in the 18th century, and I'm so appreciative of Bob's sharing Dr. John's comment about the worldview of the 18th century, because that's what it's about. There's nobody that reflects the worldview of the 18th century better than Thomas Jefferson. Even the people that agree with him, disagree with him, like him, dislike him, it doesn't matter. They all agree with that. Jefferson had one of the most alive, active, exciting minds that this nation has ever produced. We are at 42 minutes after. We've got about 15 or 16 minutes left in today's program. What I thought we might do is we could revisit some of the issues, the other issues that I had on the table in our next program. But let's take the end of the last few minutes of today's program and consider the idea of inalienable rights. The whole idea of rights. Francis Hutcheson on the idea of unalienable rights. All human power or authority must consist in a right transferred to any person or council to dispose of the alienable rights of others. Let me repeat that because it's heavy. It's heavy language. All human power or authority must consist in a right transferred to any person or council to dispose of the inalienable rights of others. In other words, power or authority must include the right to dispose of what's alienable, what's transferable. Consequently, Hutcheson says, consequently, there can be no government so absolute as to have even an external right to do or to command everything. Because all human power must include the right to transfer what is transferable, therefore the government under which they live cannot have the power to command everything. Government can't control this because human beings have to be able to do this. That's why certain rights are inalienable. The right to do that, the right to transfer property is inalienable. Property itself is not. For whenever any invasion is made upon unalienable rights, there must arise either a perfect or external right to resistance. Whenever the idea of unalienable rights is attacked, there must arise a right to resist that. Unalienable rights are essential limitations in all governments. Unalienable rights are rights that no government has the right to take away. But it is not the right to acquire property. It is the right to participate in the exchange of property. Very important distinction. Property is an alienable right. The right to exchange property, to transfer it, to dispose of it, is an inalienable right. According to this quote by Francis Hutcheson. So then we get into the question of property as an inalienable right. Specifically, Jefferson's decision to not include property in the Declaration of Independence as an inalienable right. It's not an accident. It basically speaks specifically to Jefferson. Again, here is Hutcheson on property as being considered unalienable. I'm confusing here, and I don't mean to. What we just said is that in Hutcheson's way of looking at it, property, the right to acquire property, to retain it, is not an inalienable right. But the right to exchange property, to transfer it, is. Hutcheson goes further. He says our rights are either inalienable or our rights are either alienable or unalienable. The former are known by these two characters jointly, that the translation of them to others can be made effectually, and that some interest of society or of individuals consistently with it may frequently require such translations. Thus, our right to our goods and labors is naturally alienable. Our right to goods and labors is not inalienable, it is alienable. It is susceptible to transfer. So basically, it's the right to exchange property that is the unalienable right, not the right to retain it. And here's Hutcheson again. The common interest of all constantly requires an intercourse of offices and the joint labors of many. This is important. The common interest of all constantly requires an intercourse of offices and the joint labors of many. The movement of goods and services back and forth, the movement of capital, is in the public interest, not the hoarding of capital. When mankind grows numerous, all necessaries and conveniences will be much better supplied to all when each one chooses an art to himself, by practice acquires dexterity in it, and thus provides himself great plenty of such goods as that art produces, to be exchanged in commerce for the goods produced in like manner by other artisans. Then if each one by turns practice every necessary art without ever acquiring dexterity within them, what Hutcheson is talking about is the value of division of labor, allocation of resources. The idea of a community is when the members of that community, each of them, are free to develop their art, their service, or their skills in producing or making what they produce, make, or do, and contribute it to the benefit of others. And the result of that is that the division of labor is critical to the exchange of goods and services, which forms the basis of community. The right to participate in that is unalienable. The right to take goods, wealth, profit from that and hoard it for yourself is not unalienable. Government's role is not to protect that right. Government's role is to deny that right. The public interest demands that the right to hoard not be tolerated. I would say that this falls into the category of pretty radical stuff, at least when we compare it with some of the things we hear and continue to hear in our political campaigns. Hutcheson continues, there must therefore be a continual course of contracts among men, both for the transferring of property or real rights and the constituting claims to certain services and to certain quantities or values to be paid in consideration of these services, which are personal rights. The inalienable part of rights is the right to participate in the free exchange of goods and services. And as we move towards the end of our program, may I add to that the exchange of ideas. The marketplace of ideas is the basis of community strength and community vibrance. To censor ideas from the marketplace is destructive. It is counterproductive to the public interest. Consequently, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. This is where we'll go when we come back together next Monday, if it's okay. And if you think that we ought to get off this and maybe go into another direction, by all means let me know, and I'm willing to do that. Just send me an email and say, you know, I think you've beaten this to death or whatever, because I keep finding new things that continue to make this live. That's what knowledge, that's what learning is about, is we continue to learn, to grow, to expand. We begin to understand more and more and more. Think about this statement of Hutcheson's that we just read about the ability and the freedom of all people in the community to participate in the exchange of goods and services as being the inalienable right. And then think about adding to the idea of goods and services the addition of ideas. What does that do to the way one looks at money? Mediums of exchange. The purpose of money, we hear all the time, is to measure a person's wealth. What's being implied here is that the purpose of money is to establish a basis on which the free exchange of goods and services can happen and can flourish. Money is an important ingredient of people's unalienable rights because it establishes credibility to the exchange, to people's right to participate in that exchange. The division of labor, the development of one's skills and talents, access to money, all of these things contribute to the strength and the vibrancy of community. And government's number one priority is to protect that. So if government's job is to protect people's unalienable rights, what we are introducing here is the idea that those unalienable rights consist in the ability to participate meaningfully in the community. That's the public interest. That's what government's priority needs to be about. That's where we need to be going in order to define the public interest. That's what government needs to be defending. That's what politicians need to be explaining to us. That's what they need to be advocating and supporting. not the unequal distribution of wealth and income to the few, but finding mechanisms to breathe life back into our community and its economy. Find the candidates out there that are building a political campaign on this platform and support it. That's really what it's all about. It looks like we're heading towards 59 minutes after the hour. We've got about 1 minute left in our program. So let me bring today's program to a close. I want to thank Bob Kincaid for his contribution to today's program. I think it added an immense amount. I want to thank all of you for listening. I want to invite you to join us again at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on next Monday. Please enjoy the rest of your week in July. The weather is beautiful. Enjoy it. We all deserve it. But by all means, be safe, be happy, be good to each other, and try to find a way to be with us when we get together again here at the Virtual Center. This is Bill O'Brien, thanking you so very much for being with us today. Goodbye, good luck, and thank you.